Start recording. Hello everyone and welcome to Handmade Hero, the show where we code a complete game live on stream. We are back after having moved. We have relocated the Handmade Hero machine and hopefully in that process have not destroyed anything. I sort of tested the streaming setup like just a little bit. It seems to be working okay. The setup is a little weird here, but I think we're pretty good to go. We will see. So hopefully tonight's stream will not be lost and everything will get recorded properly and streamed properly. If it doesn't, well, that is just the way it goes when you're first trying out a new streaming location, certainly. So on break, since we were off for a week, I was thinking a bunch about what we have on Handmade Hero, and we don't have a lot of engine things left to do. It's pretty full functional at this point in terms of the sorts of things that we need. And so I was kind of going through things in my head of like what are the last sorts of any big things that I want to tackle before officially saying we're done with this and we're going to move on. And I'm leaning towards, we'll see what happens at the end of this week if I change my mind, but I'm leaning towards switching over to actually using a regular 3D pipeline. It's not really a lot of work to do. We've already done all the hard work of like rasterization and all that stuff in our software renderer. So you're talking about only just a little bit of stuff for like the transforming clipping part of the pipeline. And the reason that I was thinking about that is because I really just didn't like the way things were going with all of the sort of sacrifices that I had to make in terms of what I wanted to do in order to get things to work with straight 2D with no mapping at all. And so what I was thinking about is I was like, I think I would just be more comfortable in the long run if we pretty much left everything the same in terms of all the character sprites. So they really wouldn't do anything different character sprite-wise, but all of the environment would just be mapped onto little blocks, so that basically like ground tiles were just little blocks and walls would be little raised blocks with just a sprite image on each side of them. I'm not sure, but I just feel like I might be more comfortable that way because looking at sort of the way in which things are working on the back end of the renderer now, I just feel like we have a lot, just that there's a tremendous amount of work being done back there for the sorting and all of these sorts of things. And I really just don't think it's an efficient way to do things, I mean, yes, we made it work and it can work in 2D, but I think at some point, just where I wanted to be in terms of our capabilities just doesn't mesh very well with keeping the environments entirely 2D. So I don't know. I feel like I just don't really want to leave the renderer in that state. I could change my mind, but that's just kind of what I was thinking. And so I kind of feel like I may want to just go ahead and set up an actual 3D camera and have a way of sending down a mapped cube for the environment blocks. And then those environment blocks would actually be transformed in perspective, right? They would go through the Z buffer, they'd be transferred in perspective. I would just see if that is workable with the art. Because if it is, I think I would feel a lot more comfortable about that because then I don't have so many concerns. We have like all of this special purpose code in there for doing a lot of stuff that I really just wish we didn't have to do. And I feel like it's going to create a lot of bottlenecks. Yes, we don't have to worry too much about our performance because we are a 2D game. So, we have a lot more horsepower than we need. But at the same time, I don't really like taking up that horsepower for no real purpose, right? Like it doesn't really seem like a good trade-off there, and I don't feel like I'm getting very much out of it. Like I don't feel like there's very much we can do with the sort algorithm that we couldn't have done with the Z buffer as well. And so even though it does seem like a little bit of overkill at first, just as I was reflecting, I'm just like, I don't know. It seems like, especially if we want to push the particle system stuff a little bit, we're going to run into a situation where trying to force lots of particles through a sorting backend just isn't going to work. They would have to be aggregated anyways. And then you're into these kind of nasty problems of like, well, how are the particles getting grouped for sorting and that sort of stuff? And does that make it hard for them to flow around things properly? And so I feel like we just would end up in this really nasty situation, and I don't want to put us in that situation. and have us not be able to do certain special effects that we want to do for no reason other than we have to go through a sorting backend so that we can't take advantage of the Z-buffer hardware. So I don't know. That's just my feeling on it. That's kind of what I was feeling. I pretty much only ever use 3D stuff normally, so I'm not very used to 2D programming. So that may just be, sort of the fact that I'm more comfortable with 3D than with 2D. And so maybe like it's really not as bad as I think it is, and it's just a question of, well, your first time through doing a 2D render engine. If you're very used to doing 3D render engines, you expect all of these certain things to work certain ways, and you're going to have to work around them in 2D, and it's not that big a deal. It might be something more like that. But on the other hand, it may just be that in general there really isn't a way to do high volume special effects and that sort of stuff without relying on a Z-buffer or other sorts of things. That's why we use Z-buffers, right? So I don't know. It's a really interesting question, and I'm not sure exactly what the right answer is, but just based on kind of my feelings about it, I was like, I just didn't like the level of code complexity that we had to achieve in order to do what we wanted to do. And I fully respect the fact that that's because I was trying to do some things that 2D games don't normally do, like the floor, like perspective floor shifting for like going up and down, and maybe and doing lots of like particle effects that maybe work between floors and stuff like that. I realize that's not something that pretty much happens in 2D games really very much. But at the same time, we know that because nowadays we have 3D hardware that we can do all those things if we just put things into 3D. And so, I don't know, it seems like something that we should probably do. I also don't really like the idea of having to force people to understand all the 3D stuff in order to follow it. But at the end of the day, I think it's not too much more stuff, because since we already have a transform, we already have the concept of a transform, the concept of filling rectangles with, sort of doing the standard stuff we would do with the 3D fill triangles. We could even choose not to implement a perspective correct rasterizer in the software path if we want to, right? So we don't have to take on some of that complexity if we don't want to. We just need to do the transform part. We could even not do clipping properly, right? We could do kind of like hacky clipping or something like this. But even if we did those things, they wouldn't be too big of a deal at the end of the day. It's not like a huge amount of extra code to do the front end for it. So that's just where I'm leaning towards. That's my feeling on it. So I don't know how other people will feel about that. I don't know if it's a good idea or a bad idea. Usually with stuff like this, you'll only really know once you've done it, and then you can see whether or not it really did simplify things or make things nicer, or whether it was just a waste of time. But it does seem like the kind of thing that I think when I look at what we've got right now, it's the big thing that makes me kind of upset, because I feel like it just adds a ton of complexity for no real benefit. And I'm not liking how much I have to fight the various concepts of Z values and things like this in the code base all the time for no real benefit. Like the only real benefit is we save use of the Z buffer. And that's a good thing in some sense, because it is nice to not have to use the Z buffer, because there are advantages that come with that. And certainly when you sort, you get easier edge anti-aliasing and stuff like that, better transparency, things like this. So, there are some benefits to it, but those benefits are pretty minor. And the drawbacks are pretty severe if we want to start pushing higher counts of things through the scenes, right? If we want to start having more sprites, thousands, tens of thousands of sprites and up, which is not a huge number of sprites, right? By today's standards. Pushing all those through a sorting system, it's just not a good idea. Like, I really just don't think we want to do that. And I just feel like that's going to really come back to bite us. So that's my current feeling on it. Hopefully that all makes some sense. I'm going to go ahead and ignore it for this week, because we have some stuff we can be doing. But since we're pretty much at the end of engine things, I do not know why this is pinging. That's all good. Since we have a bunch of engine things we can be doing for this week, we will probably run out some point relatively soon, and then we will have to make that decision. So I'm going to go ahead and, there we go. All right. I'm going to go ahead here and bring up our to-do list for a moment. And if I take a look at it here, really like I said, there's not a whole lot of stuff here that I really want to tackle that's still left on the list. The graphics upgrade would pretty much be, we would switch to the 3D stuff, and we'd probably do that along with the real artwork. That would be what we would do, and that would get rid of these two things. If that makes sense, that would also clean up sort of this stuff. Lighting is something that we still have to kind of talk about, and if we move things to 3D, I don't know that it would be that big of a change in how we may or may not do lighting, but it would certainly be something we could look at during that period. So I feel like this could just be the 3D graphics update if we wanted to do it that way. So let's go ahead and do the arena upgrade for sure. I just want to take a quick look here, and I would like to potentially save the arena upgrade for a day where we just start out and start doing the arena upgrades like right at the beginning of it. So I might do that tomorrow. Today, what I think I might want to do is work a little bit with this stuff, right? We also, by the way, have a simple zoomed out view for testing. So we did that to do already. What I would like to do here is just say, okay, I want to take a look at this stuff. One thing that I want to do is I want to like combine sim region and world, and I'll talk about that in a second. And then we can take a look at some of these things when we're doing that. Okay, so here's the situation as it stands at the moment, right? Right now we kind of have this situation. What day are we on here? Day 340? Yeah. So right now we kind of have this situation where we have two pieces of code. There's the sim region, and there's the world, right? And I like there's things I like about this system. I like it quite a bit so far, the way that it's working. And the idea here is that this is, potentially compressed storage. It's potentially out of core, right? We could implement a thing if we wanted to where we paged out pieces of the world and then paged them back in. So this is almost like a database style thing where it's like this external sort of thing that we talk to when we need to kind of pull in what entities are where, and it's like a spatial querying kind of thing where we can unpack them and pull them in, right? And then we have the sim region, which is the sort of the runtime, right, bit where we unpack everything. It's uncompressed, right? So the entities are actually fully occupying the space they were. It's in core. It can't be, it's going to have to fit entirely in memory, right? Obviously, which is not a big deal because it's only a little thing. It's local, right? This is global. And right now we kind of have this sort of a thing. It's a little bit janky. The reason it's a little bit janky is because when we're creating things, we really want to be creating things with a sim region. But right now, a sim region is kind of a little confusing in terms of what it does or how it works. It's in a separate file from world. World and sim region split things in a weird way. For example, the world file has the thing that does like packing entities. So like packing entities happens in the world, but unpacking them, right, happens over here. And it's a little bit strange. It's not that symmetric the way that it looks and that sort of stuff. So I don't necessarily know that we've really solidified this stuff to the degree that I would have preferred. And so what I want to do right now is I just want to kind of go look at these two things now that we pretty much know how they're working, and do kind of a couple, just basically do some code inspection, just make sure I know kind of what's going on there, and see if there's things that should be moved around or straightened out a little bit now, given the current state of everything where we pretty much know where everything goes and how it's working. So I want to do that. And while I'm in there, I would also like to look at the creation side of things. So the world creation part of things is currently a problem for us in that when we create things in the world, we have this issue at the moment where we don't actually have the ability to, like when we unpack things, when we create things, they get created in sort of an unpacked state, and then they get packed into the world. And that's how entities are created right now. There's never a concept of entities getting created inside the sim region, but that's really how we want things to go. When we're actually going about creating rooms and stuff the way that we want to do eventually, we definitely have an issue where we want to be able to say, let's work on this room, and all the entities in this room are all uncompressed at the moment, right? And we'll work with all of them. And we'll figure out how to make sure that they're all set to what they need to be set. And then we'll say, like, pack this room away. And that's exactly what we want in terms of how the sim region works, because then creating entities and packing entities and all that sort of stuff works the same during the gameplay and during world creation, which I think we want to do, because we don't really, like, we want to be able to do the same operations in both places, right? We want to be able to create entities dynamically at runtime as we see fit for gameplay reasons or any other reasons. And we also want to be able to do that, obviously, when we're creating the world initially. And so, I feel like those things really want to be collapsed, and they don't want to be different. So that's the kind of thing that I would like to get straightened away, if that makes sense. All right. So let's see. Let us see. I'm going to go over here to sim region. And I'm going to see how much code is actually in here. So, we've got some queries and stuff in here, like get closest traversable, get closest entity with brain, get closest traversable along ray, blah, blah, blah. We've got move entity, transactional occupy, blah, blah, blah. All of these things are simulation oriented. I don't know that they necessarily belong in sim region. It's hard to say, but some of them certainly do. And you can see then here we have the begin sim step, right? Where we do the packing and unpacking of the entities. So here, the unpacking of the entities, not the packing. So here is the part where entities are like unpacked. And we're not really doing much in the way of unpacking entities right now. Really all we do is pointer fix-ups. Eventually that'll do actual compressing like to put in only the data that we actually care about for a particular entity. And then here in our nsim is the place where we call out to the world to pack our entity stuff in. And you can see right here, here is where we call pack entity into world. And now if I understand correctly, from my own memory basically, how that sort of thing came about, I suspect that the reason that we had to do that is when we're doing these packing, it would make more sense for the packing to exist in the sim region, presumably, because the sim region is the thing that packs and unpacks things, to operate on them during the existence of the sim time step. But you'll notice we don't do that, right? We have pack entity stuff out here in the Handmade world. I believe the reason that we did that was strictly because we had this problem with the sim regions where we didn't have one at world creation time. So when you wanted to create entities over in the game, you had to do it calling this code directly. I think the more correct way to do this probably would be to use the sim region itself to create stuff, so that way we don't have to worry about we don't have to deal with the fact that these pack entity stuff have to be cold called from somewhere else. And that way we can inline all of it and make it like nice and efficient as we sort of figure out more what we need in terms of packing and unpacking, right? And so you can kind of imagine what this looks like. If I was to move this stuff in, let me see what has room for does at the moment. So we do pack entity into chunk, right? That's the thing that actually like sort of checks to see if there's room in the chunk and grabs one out. So, probably the has room for stuff, that seems like stuff that would stay in here. But this stuff where we do like pack entity reference and pack traversable reference, I feel like that would kind of go in here, right? And then when we do pack entity into chunk, I think pack entity into chunk, this code here that actually happens to do the packing as opposed to getting the room, I feel like that would just go in here to the nsim, right? So when we call nsim, and we're going to call pack entity into world. I think what we want to do there is we just go ahead and do that packing. So I don't really know. We're going to have to figure out ahead of time how much room we need, which may be easier said than done. We'll see when we get to that point in the code. But assuming that we have it, we know that this is the code that we're actually using right now. So this, right, if we actually did it, would be the code that we would have to use to do the packing, right? So if we were to say pack entity into world actually returned to us, I don't know why I cut that part out, but we could basically say, all right, this like reserves some space in the chunk, and we're just going to return that dest pointer. So then when we call pack entity into world or whatever, what that's going to do is that's going to return all the way out the void star, like so. And then I'm just going to do exactly what it was already doing, again, like just one step at a time. I'm just going to go ahead and say when we call pack entity into world, I'm going to say that I have a specific size that I want. You can see the pack size getting passed in here. It's just getting created by whatever the size of an entity actually is. So instead of passing in that source entity, because it doesn't actually need that, I'm just going to have it pass in what the pack size actually was, right? So that means this guy here will just pass in, hey, you know what? I want to size this to be the size of my source entity. The source entity itself, right, was just this. So that means I should be able to say, like, OK, whatever the size of the entity structure is, that's what I want you to give me packing size for. Then when we get that back, I'm going to go ahead and copy it over. So I'll take the entity pointer that I had and copy it. Then I'll do my packing, and then I'll be done, right? So that's all I wanted to do there. Here, I think all we really need to do is say, well, whenever you're going to do the packing, just give us an actual pack size. That's how we're going to know how much space to reserve. I'll have to pass that through as well here, like so. And then this pack entity into world bit, when we do end entity and begin entity for the stuff in the game, that is the stuff that I'm talking about that's going to have to change, right? We're going to need a sim region for that, and we're going to have to make the world creation code work a little bit more saner there, right? But that's not too bad. OK. So let's see. So now I feel like these need to be named more properly. So instead of pack entity into chunk, this is just like reserve or acquire chunk space or something like this, right? Or like use chunk space. Size, we'll just call this size. So that's how much we want to actually use. So when we call use chunk space, that's all we're going to do. And this would also do it. We could just have these be overloaded functions. They do exactly the same thing. It's just whether or not you need it to find out where you're going to pack it or not, right? So now we just have use chunk space. Like so. And now it's pretty clear what that does, right? It just kind of like keeps grabbing space from the chunk and getting more if it needs to, and off you go. So now we have the ability to sort of like treat that as a separate thing. And like I said, the only problem that we run into now is we don't have the ability to call the packing externally, which is the only reason, like I said, that ever would have been happening before is specifically during world creation time. And I assume that we just kind of put this in without thinking about it too much because we were just trying to keep the old world generation code working for a while we were doing other things, right? So we probably weren't thinking particularly much about how we wanted that stuff to work anyway. So what we need to do now is when we are creating things, so you can kind of see like we do add familiar and that sort of stuff. What we need to do when we're doing this code now is we're going to have to do stuff where we can know that we're putting things into a particular sim region, right? We need an open sim region so that we can do the operations that we want to do on the sim region and then pack it down when we're done. Now, one of the interesting things about this is that we kind of have an odd situation when it comes to non-simulation stuff. When we're doing world generation, we can actually cheat as much as we want, because although the sim region is conceptually a collection of entities that are all in the same place, there's actually no need for them to all be in the same place if you don't want to do collision detection and other things on them. So we can easily take a sim region that's been opened up in one part of the world, and we can stuff an entity in there that's actually on the other side of the world, and it would not actually affect the functioning of the sim region, at least not as we've currently written it. Because as far as the sim region is concerned, there's just a set of entities in an array, and where those entities are is strictly about how those entities came into the sim region. That is the only thing that actually groups them together. And when they get saved back out of the sim region, they are saved back out of the sim region based on whatever their current location is. And if that location was somewhere else in the world entirely, doesn't matter, right? So that's really the thing that I think I'm going to do first, because why not, is instead of trying to do something fancy where we actually start doing some of the world gen code, which I don't really want to do right now because I'd really like to finish up some of this engine stuff, because we're kind of close to having that, having things that I can sort of say I'm happy with how our stuff is and we're ready to move forward. So I don't really want to move on to world gen yet, but I would like to keep our current world gen working since it's what we use for testing. And so I think the easiest way to do that is just to open a sim region at the beginning, plow all of the entities that we're creating into our sim region, end the sim region, and that will pack back, right? So we really can just abuse the sim region here temporarily. There may be reasons down the road why we wouldn't want to keep doing that when we were actually doing creation. But certainly right now, we can totally do that. It's not an issue at all. And so all I really need to do here is sort of take this system where we do begin entity, end entity. I can just go ahead and, first of all, eliminate the need to do end entity at all, right? That's not necessary anymore. In fact, I'm not, and I think that'll kind of be nice, because we can just do begin entity anytime we want, and that'll add it to the sim region, and then we know when the sim region gets closed, all of those entities will get packed up automatically for us, right? Okay. So for right now, what we're going to do is, I guess we just, we don't even need to call like that or anything. We don't need to call this anymore. We don't need to do that, right? We don't need to do any of these things. And so really all we're going to have is just these two things to do. And then later I'll collapse these so that the world position P stuff is just happening automatically up in here, so that you don't have to do end entity with the world position, and then we can get rid of the end entity call altogether, right? Okay, so when you call begin entity, what we actually want to do is we actually want that to be a create entity call, and we want that create entity call to happen on the sim region, right? Now, I don't know if we've ever created an entity before. We probably haven't, because we probably had no reason to do that during gameplay at the moment. We don't have any projectiles that we create at the moment, so I don't really know that there's ever been a case where this has happened. So what we want to do here is just say, like, okay, let's make a call that'll happen in here, because we have a delete entity call, right? Let's make a call that's just like an add entity, right? Something that, since we can delete one, we can also create one. When you pass the region, it will pass you an entity back. And I think all we really need to do there is say, well, we've got the entity hash here, and we've got the max entity count. So all we really have to do is just add, this entity in and make sure that it gets hashed into the appropriate location for its ID value. So when we do create entity, I assume what we want to do is pass the entity ID, right? We want to pass one of these, and that's the entity that the ID that it will get. And we'll want to make sure that we insert it into the hash. But that's about all we would need to do. So let's go ahead and do that. I'm going to do something here, which is kind of just a random thing. Obviously, we don't, at the moment, expand the sim region if we have too many entities, right? If we exceed the max entity count number of entities in the sim region, we don't expand it to be able to hold more. Now, we might want to do that in the future, but I don't want to do that right now. And I don't actually know if I'm going to ever do that in the future. I might require that you always have a hard limit because I just don't want to deal with the possibilities of what happens when you overflow there and whether that's getting tested well enough and blah, blah, blah. So what I'm going to do instead is I'm going to make a thing called the null entity. And what the null entity is going to be is just a thing that if you try to create an entity and for some reason you have hit the hard cap. In debug mode, we would certainly assert so that we know that we've hit the hard cap. But rather than just having that crash the game or something at that point, just in case we ever hit it in actual release mode, I'm just going to have it return the null entity instead. And that way there's at least a chance that the game will keep running properly. The entity that was going to get created will not get created, but at least the game doesn't catastrophically fail, right? Now you might argue that that's not a particularly good idea because, hey, now you've just got this kind of like quiet bug in the game. I wouldn't necessarily disagree with you. What can I say? It's my code. That just happens to be the flavor that I want at the moment. And we are always free to revisit that decision in the future if it turns out to create problems for us. So here's the null entity in the sim region, right? And what I'm going to do is I'm going to start off by assuming that like that's the result, right? So if something bad happened and we couldn't get an entity the way that we wanted to, we would just return that one. OK. So then the next thing I'm going to do is say, all right, I know that we've got a max entity count, and I know that we have an entity count. And so I'm going to say if the entity count is less than the maximum entity count, then I know I can actually add one. And at that point, I know that I've got the entities array. Whatever that entities array is, plus the entity count that we currently have, that's like the next empty slot, right? And then if I increment it there, I'm going to move the pointer. I'm going to move the count past so that the next time through we'd add in the next slot and so on. If we don't have the ability to add one here, I'm going to assert rather, so that we know that we've hit a code path that we really don't ever want to be hitting, and probably something's wrong that needs to get fixed. That way, it won't happen silently in debug mode. As I said, it's really not a good situation for us to be in. OK. After I create an entity, I'm going to return it. I don't know whether I want to do this here. So I'm going to like keep this in mind, right? Because I do believe that that was a valid thing to say. And so I want to go ahead and make sure that we think about that a little bit in the future, potentially. So that's how we create an entity there. When we create it, we'll zero the struct as we create a new one. And then we'll just return it. So that's really all we need to do to create an entity. Now, because they passed in an ID, we also now want to put it into the hash properly so that other people who are looking for this entity can find this entity while we're doing creation stuff or things like that. So after we zero everything, we want to set the ID to the ID that we've been passed, and we want to insert the entity into the hash table. Now, if that's been already pulled out, then we'll just call it. If it hasn't, then we will go ahead and ensure that it actually gets pulled out into a separate function that we can then use. So let's see here. Entry. So it looks like right now, I'm not sure why exactly we're doing this the way we're doing it. So the question is, why are we adding to the hash outside of the bounds check, right? Like, why are we bothering calling getHash from ID? Because we don't even switch on that at all. It doesn't make a whole lot of sense if we're honest about it, you know? Like, it feels like that should be inside. In fact, it feels like this should just be a condition of the loop, right? It feels like it's just like, hey, don't even bother coming in here if you can't add, any more entities, right? Because it wouldn't even make sense. So I feel like unless there's something, let me see what's going on, get hash from ID. Yeah, so if we're calling get hash from ID here, it just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. It just doesn't seem to make a whole lot of sense. So when we call get hash from ID, we're going to get back an entity hash function, pointer that stores information about the entity. You can see that this kind of goes through all of the possible colliders here and looks for one place where it can stick it. And it looks like this is kind of almost a silent bug in a way, because if you look, the entity hash has 4,096 entries in it. And if we look at begin sim, when we actually push on the number of entities, that's also 4,096. And so, that just doesn't make any sense, because it means that we would start overflowing the hash bound. So we really just don't, this is just not right. Like, this should look like this, because until such time as we can verify that we could actually add the thing in, and I mean, we might as well just go full pull and say, hey, right? And furthermore, we could, like I said, just make it in here. So while there's something to add in the block and you could actually bother adding anything, keep going, right? Although I guess now I think about it, if I do it that way, I can't have the invalid code. I would like an assertion there, right? So I guess I'll just leave it inside for that reason, just to make sure that this if path is still there. I'm going to switch windows so I don't have my head obscuring things. So yeah, so when that happens, you can kind of see that we actually do this in 2 steps here. When we call get hash from ID, assert the entity pointer is 0, and then we will set these up. You can kind of see that if I wanted to, I could reorganize this piece of code to work very clearly in a fashion that would have this ID stuff get set up properly. So what I want to do is collapse this down into one function that gets called regardless of how you create the entity, right? So what I want here is a thing that's like inline void add entity to hash. And I want to take this and put it in here. And I got to pass my sim region in. And I got to pass my entity ID. But then after that, all I need to know is what am I actually storing here for the entity pointer. Right? So when I do add entity to hash, that should work. Now, what I could do here as well is just say add entity to hash actually demands that you use the entity's ID field that's inside it. That would probably make sense as well. So I'll just leave it like that for now. And then we'll just change this to be, hey, OK, so when we grab out this dest guy, I guess I'm not sure when we do the decompression step, I guess I would want to do it here and say, OK, add entity to hash and pass the sim region and the entity, which is dest. And I have to set that first, right, like so. I suppose that would be something actually that would get set up here. And then this could get deleted, presumably. So yeah. So then when we come down here and we're doing create entity, what we would need to do is after we set that, we'd have to say add entity to hash. And so that way we could actually put the entity into the hash table and it would now be capable of being looked up. In this case, I just have some typos, so nothing to worry about there. All right. So now we just have to actually get this entity stuff. We have to have a sim region to actually get it from. So what I'd like to do here is just say, well, let's take a quick look. Maybe we can just store that in the world mode temporarily, because, like I said, this is only for getting our kind of current, like, hacky sort of world gen that we're just using for testing working properly. So if I wanted to do that, all I need to be able to do is say, okay, give me back an entity using the world mode, like creation region or something like that, right? If there isn't one of those, it'll just crash because this is just the test code. We don't care, so you should never be calling this without it, if that makes sense. Okay, so when we do a create entity and we pass one of those, all we need to know is what the entity ID is going to be. We know what that is here, so I can essentially have a thing that's just internal entity ID that's like allocate or allocate entity ID, and that would be something that takes the game mode world like so. It comes in here and says, there you go, right? Entity ID result equals whatever the next unique ID was for these entities that we're going to look them up on when we choose to do so. And then I can just call that allocate entity ID and be done, right? Okay, so now what we need to do is actually have that region exist. That's not particularly hard to do. And so now we've kind of, I feel like we might be in good shape here because really that was a pretty simple piece of surgery to do, even though we kind of drastically changed the way that worked, because it's just, I guess we're just, we're doing a reasonable job keeping our architecture under control, even though it's doing some fairly complicated stuff. So hey, it turns out we could just make that change. And all we really need to do here is just say, well, when we're going to create this stuff, where we go to start creating entities, so, here is the first time. Where are we here? I guess it would be add wall, probably. Yeah. So I'm guessing like the first thing we do when we come down here, right? We haven't added anything yet. When we create the world, all we do is make some collision stuff. So the first things we do when we come in here and we start to try and make stuff is we're going to call add standard room, which is going to call like add wall and stuff like that. So really we just have to, before we try to do any of that, we just have to do a thing where we'll say like, okay, creation region equals, a new sim. We got to go through here until we're all done, right? And we've created everything, blah, 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 blah. And I guess at that point, I don't even know, something to add walls there? I don't even know what that's supposed to be. And then we just do an end region here. If that makes sense. So that's really all I want to do. Again, not too fancy there. But like everything else, we need some place for this thing to actually operate, right? We need some way for it to actually, something for the begin sim, end sim pair to actually work with. And so inside the sim region, I believe, when we do begin sim, right, we push one of these guys on, and we don't have any way at the moment of cleaning that up. We just use the temporary bounds. Like we use the begin temp memory and temp memory to make that work, right? And so we would need to do the same thing for that here. And so if we wanted to do that, all we would have to do is say, take a look at the same way that we were doing this in the other parts of the code, right? Where we say, all right, begin temp memory, pass in the Tran arena, and then later we just do the end temporary memory, like so. And that's basically it. So now what we would have to do is just add a place for that to be stored. So in here, you know, when we're talking about the last used storage index, instead of this stuff, we would have a sim region pointer that's like the creation region. And when we do that end sim, that begin sim and that end sim, on the end sim, as soon as we do that, I'm going to set the world mode creation region to 0, just in case anyone tries to use it. It'll crash immediately because I don't want anyone touching it anymore. And then when we do begin sim, I need to pass the loading bounds, which I don't really care about, but I can pass basically anything I want here, right? So when we call begin sim here, we've got the sim arena. I got to pass the world mode, which we obviously have, and the worlds. And then I've got the origin and the bounds, the DT, and the particle cache. I don't have to pass the particle cache. It can be 0, right? Which is good. I don't have a DT. I don't really want a rectangle 3 because I don't want it to load any entities anyway. And I don't really want an origin either. So really, I'm just kind of calling this as a dummy, one that doesn't have anything to do with anything, because I just want one that's going to temporarily store some stuff for me. So, oops. So yeah. There we go. Are we building? I thought so. It's like that build looks slow. Somehow we're still building in optimized mode. I don't know why. All right. So let's see how much damage we've done here now. If we try to run the game, what we have destroyed, if that makes sense. So let's take a look. So problem that we're probably, we could easily run into here is that these regions get, oh. Well, that doesn't look right at all. Where's my call stack? Begin entity, add player. Update and render world. Ah, yes. So I guess we do have sort of another situation here, which is that when we do add other things, we sort of add players out of bound to that world creation process, which again is fine. We just need to make sure that when we actually do something like that, we have some way of actually making that go into the mode it needs to go into when you're adding a player, right? In other words, this would have to be sort of encapsulated and use a sim region. Now, the interesting thing is the sim region, we actually know about it. So if we actually were passing sim regions here, we would actually be fine. Because we just passed the sim region in that we already have. Because we know when we add a player that we already have a sim region. So I'll cheese this for now, but then maybe we'll just go ahead and start to unwind that code as well, because why not? We might as well make it a little bit cleaner. We're going to have to refine this code eventually, at least this part that like adds entities and stuff. So that doesn't seem like a waste of time to me. It's not the actual world gen code, right? It's just something that adds entities. So yeah, the cheese version of this, right, is this. The cheese version just sets and unsets the creation region to whatever the sim region is that we're currently using. But pretty cheesy because it's pretty easy to mess up, right? Okay, so let's take a look at now where we're at. We're at game update and render worlds. We're updating brains here, I guess. It does appear so. And when we're calling execute brain, we're trying to do a transactional occupy of an occupying segment. When we do the transactional occupy, it looks like it gets back a null for whatever we're passing. Now, that actually looks like that actually looks like the kind of thing we probably would want to keep relatively safe anyway. Like, I'm not sure that this should really be unguarded the way that it is. Like, it seems like returning 0 here would be a valid thing, like if desired and not desired occupier. So I'm going to change that, but we almost certainly still have a bug because the fact that that wasn't happening before, but I just don't want to kind of leave that in the code base because that's probably a bad idea as well, if you ask me, because I feel like that's the kind of thing that should be able to fail. If someone just passes like, hey, can I transaction occupy this invalid location that I got back from some query that said like you couldn't go anywhere, that's the kind of thing that we don't really want to have to guard upstream all the time. And so it seems like that is just a much better way to do it, if that makes sense. Max entity velocity. Yeah, so that's just probably, I wonder if I can just skip that. That's just probably, again, like I said, we probably have a bug here with how we're packing things down. But since we can't see, we don't really know how bad it actually is. However, yeah, so I'm not gonna touch the max velocity thing. I'm just gonna step through now when we actually do some down packs and make sure that they actually look correct to me. I'm also gonna take a quick look here. So I want to take a quick look at nsim. Where is my nsim? I just want to take a quick look at how we're packing down these guys. All right, so what I want to do is I want to set a breakpoint here so I can see what's going on when we've created the worlds. I want to then go through and set a breakpoint when we're about to end our world sim stuff, right? So when we kind of go through here and we do an nsim, and I'm kind of grabbing these entities out here, I want to see what these entities look like that I've added. And also, I'd like to see how many we added, right? This is the whole world gen as it currently stands. So we added 407 entities, which seems like a reasonable number because remember, all of our ground chunks, all of our ground like things you can stand on, and the trees and the sprites, like everything is a entity at this point. So we would expect that number to be relatively high for the little rooms that we're making. So, all right, that seems like a reasonable number to have created. And now I would like to take a look at the entities themselves. So here is like an entity that's going to get packed down. It's got an ID of 7, which, you know, seems reasonable. I think that probably was because we reserved some from it, space for other things. We've got no particular brain ID, no real values here to speak of anything in particular. It has the X and Y axis set properly, which is good. That is what we want. It's got one traversable on it. It is not occupying anything, so that's good. You can kind of see its traversables here. It is true that that traversable doesn't seem to be set to anything in particular. I'm going to look to make sure that that's just not where it happens to be. So that, I guess that would make sense too, because presumably its position in the world is just where it's at. I don't know why it has a hit point array that's filled. Oh, probably just because the address has changed. There's its position, and they're all at different positions. Those positions seem reasonable. So that all actually seems pretty reasonable. I'm interested to know, maybe did I introduce a problem here? We'll find out in a second. So here I am setting up the entity stuff, you know, placing the entity where it needs to go. Entity p plus equals chunk delta, well, which is just where it's going to be moved to. Is that right? What is that? What is going on there? Chunk p equals entity p, chunk p offset 0, chunk delta offset minus entity p. Entity p plus equals chunk delta. That code looks a little weird, don't you think? Not to mention the fact that so was all we were doing there trying to do stuff where we removed somebody from the correct, because we don't actually have to remove people anymore. I feel like that was probably code that's left over from having to remove people, right? Because nowadays, the chunk delta stuff, I feel like that is really not that necessary for anything anymore. Right? I mean, do we really even need that? Hold on a second before I get any further into that, now that we're in this area. I just am curious. So chunk delta, what do we do with it? All we do is do entity p plus equals chunk delta. Okay. And we don't really modify any of this code, any of these positions, do we? No, we don't. So really all this is doing that renormalization step that we already have in the other code. It does seem, that just seems like kind of a waste to me, right? That just really seems like kind of a waste. And it looks like in general, like when we're looking at this here, it just doesn't seem like any of this is necessary. So if we take a look at what entity p does, we're basically just seeing whether or not we need to do the little apron scrolling thing. Yeah, I don't love this code. I feel like this could be really simplified now because we've gotten things down to much cleaner in terms of what it needs to do in the code. And so I feel like this stuff is not as necessary as it perhaps once was. But anyway, that's neither here nor there at the moment. I just want to fix that. So when we do use chunk space and we pass that chunk p down, which is the place where we want the space to get used, I don't feel like anything here should have changed appreciably, right? We're just passing the size. We know we wanted to store one entity's worth. When we come in here, we check to see if we can get it. Assuming that we can get it, we take up the use, we take up the space that we had wanted to take up. And then we just return the pointer to the data, which I store here and romp with the entity information. And of course, I also then update the pieces that need to kind of get packed down. But that seems like pretty straightforward, right? That's not particularly tricky. So I'm not sure why that would cause anyone any problems. Add entity to hash, on the other hand, we haven't really looked at too much, but it looks, it was not a particularly complicated code change. I feel like it would be pretty straightforward. And we do set the IDs beforehand. So that should all be nice and clean. When we do the get hash, we set the pointer and the ID, which is exactly what we want. Now, granted, I don't really know why we bother storing the ID, because we could just store just the pointer, but I guess maybe we want to avoid the double lookup. Anyway, back to our show. So we come in here, we've got one of these entities, and we're going to pack it down. Here's our dest entity, here's our regular entity, right? And these things should be roughly equivalent. They do appear to be, for the most part. Looks pretty good. There we go, there's the P. There's that P value. Looks the same. Yeah, so the only real question is here, do we mess something up in terms of how traversables get packed down or something like this? I wouldn't assume so. I also just realized too that now that we've done this, we may have to postpone the debugging till tomorrow, but now that we've done this, I've got my sim region that gets passed here. I think we now no longer need the sim region because now we've removed that dependency, which is really nice actually. Because that, you can see how this code would definitely got nicer because now it's separated along the correct boundary, but before we sort of had mixed up the chunk-based world storage with the need to pack entities, and we got this kind of like hybrid that wasn't particularly good. Now we just know we're packing some things into this. We don't really care what they are or what they're doing because someone else is going to take care of that. And that's much nicer now. And you can see how that kind of made things get cleaner. Unfortunately, we still got a bug somewhere. So we'll have to do something about that. But at least we're pretty good to go. I will probably go to the Q&A now just to make sense. Just to make sure that people have a chance to ask questions. But while I'm waiting for questions, so we'll go to the Q&A. While I'm waiting for questions, I will continue to kind of just peruse until I see a question on there. Because as you know, I don't like leaving bugs in the code if I can avoid it. So yeah. What did we, when we do entity star? Let's see here. I could also comment this out and see if there's any visual clue as to what the problem was with that. So let's see here, max velocity. That's actually pretty handy, because that's sort of like, if we can get more information about what we're doing wrong, we might be able to pinpoint the bug more quickly. So we call update and render entities. Our came from here is null, so it wasn't on anything to begin with, it looks like. Get simspace traversable, therefore fails. I would say, again, that's the kind of thing I kind of want to guard against. I feel like we'll want to harden these routines. Probably I'll take some time at some point to actually harden them specifically, just go through to do that. Because these are the kind of things that are going to be getting called from like very spaghetti-like random gameplay code that's just going to be kind of weird and wild, you know? And so I do kind of want these to be more crash-proof. That is pretty cool. Can I just say? I have no idea what it's doing, but it's pretty great. Let me take a look here. Snoring Tortoise. Did you resolve the kerning horizontal advance for kanji characters? I found when implementing myself on OS X at the font table level that Arial doesn't actually have kanji in it. It seems Windows and Mac, the higher level APIs like Cortex, load multiple font files for you if it detects that you are trying to load a code point that is outside the range of a particular font file. I don't really recall. You'd have to go back and look at those, the font episodes. To my recollection, I didn't super care too much about getting the kerning loaded properly on those because I'm assuming that the actual fonts we would use for the game would be coming in as bitmaps that we would set the kerning on. But yeah, I don't know. Even if that was the case, I don't know why that would affect the kerning because it should be able to. I thought the problem we were having with the kerning was that it wasn't matching what would happen if we went into a Windows, like a normal text editor in Windows and did it. And so I would have expected to get the same results out since we were using their API, if I remember correctly, to extract the glyphs. So, I don't necessarily expect it to be good kerning because most operating system fonts that I see, most fonts in general have lousy kerning anyway. So I don't think I would have been upset about the kerning being lousy, but I would have expected it to match, and I thought it wasn't matching Windows, right? And so that was kind of just weird because even if they are loading multiple fonts behind your back, it should still report the same thing to Notepad as it reports to me, and it didn't seem like that was what was happening. So that's the kind of, that's the kind of thing that I was talking about back then. So what happens here? We get the entity P and the chunk P. We zero out the offset. We take the chunk delta, and that's the offset there. That gets added back in. That's all fine. We say use whatever the chunk P was. The chunk P was the thing we used for the entity's position. When we begin sim, I assume that's all set correctly. We add the entity to the hash. We set its chunk delta. We set its P by moving the chunk delta. When we pack the P down, I see. We're removing the delta because whatever the chunk is that it gets stored in, that is the chunk offset that we use. So that's reasonable. That all seems reasonable. What I don't know is what we were saying. Cyberpunk Hobo, can you explain what the idea is behind using a zero-sized sim region bound? Yeah, so basically, when we first create the world, there are no entities in it anyway. So there's no need to discuss what the boundaries are of the sim region, because the boundaries of the sim region are only actually used for streaming in the entities in the first place and setting their flags. But we don't have to do that at the outset of ours, of the creation pass, because there are no entities to stream in, right? And so basically, I was just setting the bounds to null and all that because there really wasn't any need. That's all. That's all it was really. because the sim bounds don't really do anything else. Later on, we might want to set them because we may actually be using more elements of it. But yeah. So it looks like the problem we have is when I went and did the pack unpack thing, it looks like I accidentally introduced some kind of a packing error with P with the position of the entities. And so I'm interested to take a look at that because you could sort of see, like I was saying, just getting a clue from what's happening here when I commented that out. You can kind of see how everything is sort of moving and gravitating in this weird way. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. It sort of seems, like maybe the camera and all the entities are zooming through space diagonally down, right? Or something to this effect. So it feels to me like we've got a problem with the way that P is being packed and unpacked, but that's just my initial assumption. And so if we take a look at how P is being packed and unpacked, we may see something that I messed up when I made the changes. So, when we get the dest P, we're assuming that whatever we get here, whenever we unpack an entity, we're assuming that we're going to get okay. I think I see what we did wrong there. Or at least one of the things. So if we go back here to world mode, where we were actually creating this stuff. So when we call end entity, we're setting this entity P offset here, right? And we're not actually setting the world location properly in that case, right? The world position is actually going to be some actual position that we need to set properly in entity P in order for it to get packed down, right? So what we need to do here instead is when we actually pass this world position, so like, we say end entity here, these are all taking those world positions. Whenever we say end entity, we have to actually use that position when we get it, right? So we would have to do, say, inside world mode. I'm sorry, inside world. When we actually get one of these world positions back, we would want to do the subtraction to take a look at where that actually was relative to the sim region that it's going to get packed next to, right? So we would want to do a thing here where we say, like, okay, the actual entity P is going to be the subtraction of this guy and whatever the sim region bounds are. Right? World is an undeclared identifier. Hey, guess what? That's because it's not supposed to be world. It's supposed to be world mode. And element 2 to world position star. Does that help? So now we're actually setting that position correctly, which is at least a little better. So now we've actually at least restored some working functionality here, but we still got some issues. Like you can see that we're not really working quite right. People are going through trees and such, and other sorts of things like this. So we're not quite there yet, but at least we sort of fixed one obvious major issue, and we're mostly back to good, right? So that's good. Getting there. Still no questions, huh? So I'm relatively pleased with that. I think that's a good thing. It means that we can now be a little more confident in how we're doing that process. Oop, don't go off the edge of the world. So that's getting better, although there's still some bugginess there, like people are getting stuck are able to walk into traversables where there should not be traversables. So we still have some unusual thing where they're able to find those traversables even though they shouldn't, right? Like those traversables should be occupied by the trees or something like this. And so I'm not sure exactly why they're not. I think that may be because we might have done some weird hackiness there because we didn't have the clean way of creating things before. I'll have to take a look. For example, when we add a wall, when we do occupying equals standing on, and then we do end entity, that will do the pack down. I feel like that should be fine. I feel like that should work. It at least feels like it should work. Yeah, I'm not sure. Meow, 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 meow. So I guess one thing I can do right now, though, is I can get rid of end entity, which I wanted to do. Oh, I'm supposed to be not really programming right now, though. I'm supposed to have ended, if that makes sense. But I believe what's happening there is if you look at what's happening, I obviously can't go into these trees, right? And the reason for that is because my head still runs through the collision detector, right? We are still running the head through the collision detector. But the reason that other people can't go through the trees is just because, remember, you have to hop onto a legitimate square. That was the rules of the game. And so the AIs are just required to find something to hop on, right? That's all they actually need to be able to do is to find something to hop on. And so they don't have to go through the collision detector, right? And that's sort of by design at the moment. Like, we probably will want to push them through the collision detector eventually, depending on how we feel about it, and we'll see. But at the moment, they're not supposed to go in collision detector, but they should never hop into the trees, and we're not hopping into the trees before, because those trees are supposed to be occupying the squares that they're on. Ergo, you should never be able to hop on them. So either the tree would occupy it, or we could just not create a walkable there. But what we were doing before is creating a walkable point and putting the tree on it, and then you should not be able to get at that point, right? But what we're seeing instead is that that's not happening, right? So probably who's at fault there is that the trees, when they're packing down, are not correctly saving their reference to the thing that they were on. But I don't know, I haven't looked at it yet. Invincible Chaz, I've just started watching the stream. How often have you needed to refactor major parts of your code? Well, I think that kind of... So I guess what I would say is I tend not to like the word refactoring only because it's really non-specific. So, you know, it's a good term to use when you're just kind of throwing stuff around there like, oh, I'm doing some refactoring right now or something, because it's always true. But it makes it kind of hard to be specific about what you're actually doing. What I would say is that I don't generally, unless I'm trying to figure out like an algorithm or something, I don't generally consider my time to be divided into refactoring and not refactoring, if that makes sense. I am always refactoring to some extent, right? Like, most of what I'm doing when I'm programming is trying to refine the code into a better state than what it's in right now. because I don't believe in the methodology of trying to design things up front before you actually have written them, and then like writing them out from there and hoping that you got it right. Because that's where you really see stuff like a question, like you said, where you said like, how often do you have to do a major refactoring? That's really the only time that you have quote unquote major refactoring as an event, is because you were like, oh, whoops, I got it wrong what the design was, so now I have to do my major refactoring. But otherwise, I'm not really refactoring or something. But I don't really like that mental approach to programming. In my opinion, you should always be refactoring, right? You should always be looking for ways to improve the architecture of your system. And that can be in very small ways, such as renaming a function to make it more clear what it does, something that simple. Or as complicated as I'm changing the way that this entire renderer gets queued or something. That's all in a day's work. And I don't tend to think of it as I have to go do a major refactoring now. And furthermore, I also try to, and you've seen me do this many times on stream if you're someone who's watched a long time, but you said you're new to the stream, so obviously you wouldn't have seen this yet. But the other thing is that I always try to take any big change, whether it's refactoring or just creating something new. It doesn't have to necessarily be refactoring. It could just be the initial walkthrough of something. I always try to break it into smaller steps. And the reason that I do that is for two reasons. One, it keeps the debugging more simple than it was before, right? Because now if you're only making smaller changes at a time, you can more easily identify what code may have broken, right? It doesn't always work because you still can get very tricky bugs, but it definitely cuts down on the amount of tricky bugs you get because you haven't just changed the whole thing at once, right? And the other reason I do that is because it gives me a good metric along the way as I'm programming to know whether the change that I'm doing is actually good. If you have a mentality where you're like, it's refactoring week, and I refactored all the code or whatever, then you can very easily get into a state where the refactoring you did actually puts you in a worse state than when you started, right? Because one of the things that's very true about code architecture is nobody, and I mean literally nobody, can keep it all in their head at the level of detail they need to make the exact right decisions without doing actual programming. It just doesn't work. I'm actually one of the people who I would count highest on the list in terms of size of system they can keep in their heads. And I can tell you for a fact that I am nowhere close, right, to being able to do that sort of stuff. And so I feel like the sane way to do that kind of architecture work is to always break it into parts and always do it incrementally so that you can see very clearly whether you've made a good decision or not, and so that you can abort that attempt at changing the code if you see very quickly, in those steps that it's not going to come out the way that you want it to, right? So you're trying to also maximize the chances that you'll be getting the information you need to change, to either change or just completely abort the change that you were going to make, modify or cancel the change that you thought you were going to make, based on that information that you're getting as you sort of go through the process. And so I think one of the biggest mistakes you can make as an architect early on, before you've had enough experience with it, is definitely trying to do too big of changes at once, assuming that the picture in your head of why the change is good is correct. Because a lot of times the devil really is in the details in programming, and you've forgotten, maybe it might just be one little thing you've forgotten, but you did forget it, and it means that that change will actually leave you in a worse position than you were when you started, or perhaps it's just a wash. So you do all this work and you end up with no really benefit for it, or even a detriment. And I've seen that happen lots of times. So I would just say that's a very important thing to be aware of. So that's the approach we take on Handmade Hero. We try never to have a time when we say that the thing we're doing is just doing a big rewrite of all this code. I try to keep it as incremental as possible, and I try to even when we know that we're going to replace some system or do a new version of a system that works quite differently, we take that in as granular a pieces as possible, both to keep the debugging down and also to make sure that we can check ourselves as we go. The other fringe benefit you get by keeping things manageable in that way too, that I would point out, is it also helps keep your morale up as a programmer. Over time, depending on your proclivities, you can definitely get to the point where you can do very large swaths of code without your mind meandering, right? But certainly when you're first starting out, I think this is true a lot of times, is that if you bite off something really big and you're like, I got to do this whole thing, if you can't break it into smaller, more achievable pieces, you will take way longer to do it because you're not getting that sort of feedback loop of like compile, run, see something happen, get some information. It's a really much easier way to keep your brain going forwards at a reasonable rate. Whereas if you're like typing in miles and miles of code before anything works or even compiles, that's just a really bad place to be in, generally speaking. You know, on Handmade Hero, it's a little more aggressive than maybe I would want because I only do an hour so that people can follow it. And yeah, that's not the size of a coding session I want. I usually want 2 hours, a short break, and then another 2 hours or something. If I'm going to do any kind of major work on a code base, that's probably what I'm looking for. But that is what I'm looking for. At the end of that 4 hours, I generally want to be in a place where I'm at least compiling. I at least know what's going on with the code and can see how it's lining up and all that sort of stuff. And that's after years of practice, right? And even then, I still just don't like to go that long without having some kind of verification there. And so I think that's a really important thing to remember, especially when you're first starting out. Try to break things into achievable pieces. The first question you should ask yourself anytime you're trying to consider a major change or a major new system when you're just starting it. Can I break this into more achievable pieces? Because that will really help you on a number of fronts. And it's just good practice in general for a number of reasons. Even if you are already very experienced, I find it's the right approach the vast majority of the time. The noble one. Is the millisecond counter in the corner the render time for the frame? No. It's the amount of time we are currently counting between frames being displayed. So basically, it doesn't, like if you take a look in here, you can actually see this information on the profiler. So if I pause the profiler for a second, so we won't take any more profile snapshots, and we go over here and take a look at what's going on, you can see we've got the game update here, which is a very, very small fraction of the total frame time. So that's actually the amount of time we're spending. Then we've got our debug stuff, which is just debug collation, which takes a ton of time because we collate a bunch of debug information. So that's actually not included in the game time. If we turn the debug system off, that would all go away. And then up here is just us waiting for the graphics card, which is we have VSync turned on. So some portion of this could be rendering time. If we turn VSync off, we would know. We haven't done that. We don't have a button for that at the moment, I don't think. I probably should add one. So a lot of time is also like a third of the time or so here is spent just waiting around for the graphics card to display. Also, this time is not actually accurate in terms of how long we would take in an actual gameplay situation because we're compiled in debug mode right now. So if you take a look at like how the clocks are aligned here, you can kind of see this is our top list. So 26% of our time is spent in debug work. 24% of our time is spent sending stuff to OpenGL. 15% is spent processing the debug information, not just drawing it. And then we get down to actual code, right? So 75% of our time is not actually spent in us actually doing anything. It's all in other systems that are, either the graphics side of things or our debug system. We can turn all of those off, but unfortunately, as soon as we start to turn off everything, Like if we turn off the whole debug system and stuff, we then can't get very much profiling information. So we can't, at some point we might want to make something that turns off everything except just the profile zones or something like this. But if we compile in optimization mode, a lot of that stuff gets a lot faster because the compiler actually does a much better job of producing real code. And so if you take a look at that now, you can kind of see a more accurate picture of what's going on here. When these kind of get taken out of the equation a little bit more, you can start to see that, yeah, so 56% of the time when we actually compile an optimized build, so well over half that frame time, which is at 60 frames a second, right? 16.6 mils. At 60 frames a second, we spend most of our time just waiting for the graphics card to flip the page. And again, I think most of that's VSync because if you take a look at what we're passing down here, it's just not very much in terms of graphics load. We haven't really done anything to try and optimize our OpenGL usage at all. It's very, very simple. But even so, I suspect that it's pretty much all VSync. I mean, even this card, which is old, it's a 10-year-old card, is probably not having any trouble pushing this at 1080p. So probably most of that's VSync, but some of it might be graphics rendering. And then we just get down to like feeding the graphics card, which probably is just because we're not doing it efficiently. I'd have to see why we're getting so much there. It could be, no, I don't think the sort is baked in there. So I'm not sure why OpenGL Redux is taking that time. That's probably something we should look at why to verify that it isn't something stupid we're doing. But then, yeah, we get down to just our actual code here. Only takes about 4% of the frame time is our actual code. And Neil, I agree that we should put in some OpenGL query timers. When we decide to do some work with OpenGL for reals, like because we only use very simple, we don't really do much with it at the moment. When that's expanded out more, maybe towards the back half of the game, after the game's, the game part of the game is more implemented, and we just want to mess around with some graphics, sort of glitz on it, we would totally like some query timers. Fort99, I was about to ask what would happen if one of those snaky guys got themselves stuck in a corner, but I see one already did. Yeah, it's interesting. I don't really know what to do with the snaky guys in the future. I kind of like the fact that they can get stuck. I mean, we haven't really tried to do any real monsters. I just kind of implemented some stuff so we could see whether or not it was convenient to implement them in our system. And as we go forward, we'll continue to improve on those sorts of things. But basically, like, this game is not supposed to have super smart enemies. It's kind of supposed to have very predictable and fairly dumb enemies. But, a fair number of them on the screen. Like I said, it's a Zelda Binding of Isaac-y feeling kind of thing I was kind of shooting for. So I don't really want, like the sort of military shooter, the enemy knows to like throw a grenade to flush you out and then, shoots you from the side kind of a thing or whatever. That's not really what I'm looking for. So at the end of the day, if we do end up using snakes, if we do end up having some monsters that are snake-like, which I suspect we will because it's kind of cool, I would probably say let's just let them get stuck if they get stuck. I feel like that's just serendipitous. And, maybe we add something to their code to try and prefer not to go into coils or whatever might cause that to happen. But, like, I'm fine with the player just having a good time. And, if a snake gets stuck, or better yet, the player, like, pushes a block into a way in such a way that makes it likely that the snake gets stuck, and then it does, that seems to me like pretty in keeping with the spirit of this kind of game. So I wouldn't be inclined to do too much work to prevent something like that. Snoring Tortoise, Off topic, since there wasn't any sound in the pre-stream, are there any sneak peeks regarding HandmadeCon you can give us? Well, with HandmadeCon, I tend to try and release the information about speakers as soon as I can. Unfortunately, this year, it's been really hard to get final confirmations from a lot of people. So it's always like, well, you know, I'm still trying to get total confirmation from all the people who I need to get complete confirmation from. And, you know, it's mostly there, but I just haven't been able to get people to give the total confirmation that I need to be able to continue. And so that's just an ongoing effort. It's been a real pain in the butt this year, if I don't mind saying so. Just trying to get everything nailed down. I was much luckier last year in terms of how simple it was to arrange to get everyone sort of to be able to commit and say yeah. And part of that is just this year, you know, I feel like the people who I asked, or at least a cross section of people I asked, definitely had to do more work potentially to say yes. Either because, you know, they had to get clearance from a legal department or public relations department or whatever. And so, you know, that sort of thing, especially when you're asking high-level people, you know, at HandmadeCon, I try to get people who really know what they're doing and typically occupy a fairly important place in their organization. You know, they've got a ton of stuff to do every day, and it's hard to wrangle all of those cats that you need to wrangle. And, you know, you have to remember, oh, right, I got to do the thing for HandmadeCon, see if I can get the lawyers to sign off on me speaking there or whatever. So I think it's tough sometimes for some speakers, depending on what companies you work for, to be able to agree to stuff in a timely fashion. And that just does mean that in general, like, you know, stuff takes longer than possibly I would like to be able to announce the speakers. So there's that. At the moment, there's really only one, I think, that I'm having trouble getting confirmation from. Ironically, some of the people who have had to do a bunch of stuff like getting stuff cleared actually did a very good job getting it done in time. And so I think right now the only people I'm waiting on are actually people who don't have to do that. So I'm hoping that they can make definitive plans sometime soon. All right, I think I'm going to close it down soon. Let's see here. So before I do, I'm just going to say that here we've got bug in what do we call those things? Traversables, where trees aren't occupying their spots. I mean, it'll be pretty obvious, I suppose, when we boot up tomorrow. It's unlikely that I won't notice the fact that people are hopping through the trees, which they never used to do before. So probably not a huge necessity to put in that to do, but it can't hurt just so we don't forget it in case I would have forgotten it. All right. Thank you, everyone, for joining me for another episode of Handmade Hero. It's been a pleasure coding with you, as always. If you would like to follow along with the source at home, you can always do so by pre-ordering the game on handmadehero.org. It comes with the source code every night. I update it so that you can do experiments at home with the code base and learn along with the series. We also have a forum you can go to ask questions if you have questions about what's happening on the show or how the code works. We also have a Patreon page you can go to if you want to support the video series, and we have a schedule bot that you can use that you can subscribe to if you want to know when we're going to be live. There's also an episode guide maintained by the fabulous Miblo and it tells you what all of the episodes have been in the past. It allows you to look at like time-coded information on them, so you can jump right to when we've talked about certain things. So it's a pretty handy way to catch up on parts of the series that you may have missed if you want to. That's about it for this week. I will be back tomorrow. I'm on an alternating schedule now. I'm going to try that for a while. 8 p.m. and 5 p.m. streams. So I do 8 p.m., 5 p.m., 8 p.m., 5 p.m. That's just an experiment for now, because there are some people who kind of like the 5 p.m.s and some people kind of like the 8 p.m.s. And I did have an opportunity now to kind of like arrange my schedule to have that happen. We'll see. It could be a complete disaster or it could be good. We'll see. But so tomorrow I will be back here, but I'll be back here at 5 p.m. For the stream. That's about it. Hope everyone has a good evening of coding, and I'll see you all tomorrow. Take it easy, everyone.